London in the spring of 1816 was a city that watched its daughters closely, and judged them more closely still. In a fashionable tea-room just off St. James's Street, amid the hush of porcelain and the faint bitterness of oversteeped leaves, a young woman sat alone at a small marble table. Her posture was composed, her gloved hands folded with deliberate care, yet her solitude spoke more loudly than any breach of manners. In a society where respectability was measured by accompaniment, to be unescorted was to be exposed. She was known, if she was known at all, as Miss Eleanor Hartwell, the orphaned niece of a naval officer whose name had once been spoken with pride and later with disapproval. The war had ended, but memory had not softened. Though her uncle's disgrace had not been of her making, it clung to her like a shadow, shaping every invitation withheld and every glance weighed too long. Eleanor had learned, at an early age, the discipline of restraint. She kept her voice gentle, her gaze lowered, her hopes modest, for anything more invited comment. Across the room, conversation fluttered and hushed as she entered awareness. Two matrons paused, their expressions tightening into polite vacancy. A younger lady whispered behind her fan, eyes flicking toward Eleanor with a curiosity sharpened by judgment. The slight was quiet, but it landed heavily. Eleanor lifted her teacup with steady fingers, willing herself not to hurry, not to reveal the sting beneath her calm. Dignity, she knew, was a defense that must never crack, for once broken it was never mended. It was then that another presence altered the air. The Dowager Duchess of Ravens Hollow entered with unhurried authority, her age worn like a decoration rather than a burden. She required no announcement. Conversation adjusted itself around her, chairs shifting, heads inclining. Her gaze moved through the room with practiced discernment until it rested upon Eleanor, and something like recognition stirred there. The Duchess approached without hesitation. She did not offer greeting at once, but studied the young woman as one might a familiar portrait rediscovered in poor light. At last she spoke, her voice low, edged with command softened by age. "You were kind once," she said, "when kindness was inconvenient." Eleanor looked up in surprise, then remembered the Sailor's Widow's Fund, the draughty hall, the afternoon spent listening rather than speaking. She inclined her head. "I did only what was proper, Your Grace." "Proper?" the Duchess repeated, with faint amusement. She drew nearer, lowering herself into the chair opposite Eleanor with a decisiveness that discouraged protest. The room seemed to recede, as though aware that something consequential was unfolding. The Duchess leaned forward, her gloved hand resting upon the table's edge. "My son requires assistance," she murmured. "And so, it seems, do you." Eleanor stiffened, instinct warning her of danger masked as opportunity. The Duchess continued, her words measured and exact. "The Duke of Ravens Hollow," she explained, had become the subject of unhelpful speculation. His position in the House of Lords demanded an image of stability, yet certain circles, encouraged by the Prince Regent's acquaintances, pressed him toward a match that threatened both his principles and his influence. Rumor, once loosed, could not be recalled. It must be redirected, guided, and carefully contained. "I ask you to pretend," the Duchess said, her eyes unwavering, "that you are my son's fiancée. Only for this season." The tea-room seemed suddenly too warm. Eleanor's breath caught, though she kept her expression neutral. Such a pretense was no trifling amusement. To accept was to step onto a narrow path, bordered by scandal on either side. To refuse was to remain what she already was, unprotected, overlooked, and vulnerable to quieter, more enduring cruelties. She searched the Duchess's face for levity and found none, only calculation tempered by necessity. "What would become of me," Eleanor asked quietly, "when the season ends?" The Duchess's reply was honest, and therefore unsettling. "That will depend upon your discretion, and upon my son's." Eleanor considered the weight of those words. She had lived her life avoiding notice, guarding her name as if it were a fragile inheritance already chipped by circumstance. She had survived by caution, by making herself small, by never asking more than was offered. Yet here was an offer that promised visibility, and with it danger, but also a chance to shape her own narrative rather than endure another's. She thought of the empty chair opposite her at every table, of doors politely closed, of a future narrowing through inaction. She also thought of the cost of being found false, and the heavier cost of remaining invisible. "I will not be a spectacle," Eleanor said at last. "Nor a jest passed between drawing rooms." "You will be neither," the Duchess replied. "You will be respected, because I shall insist upon it." Agreement was reached not with flourish, but with a nod and a breath released. No hands were shaken, no promises written, yet the decision felt irrevocable. When the Duchess rose to leave, she paused, her shadow falling briefly across the table. "You will meet my son this evening," she said. "He values clarity, and he does not suffer fools." As Eleanor watched her depart, she felt the room's attention return, sharpened now by curiosity rather than disdain. She finished her tea, long since cold, and rose with care, aware that every movement was newly observed. The lie had begun before she had spoken it aloud, and already it demanded courage she was not certain she possessed. Outside, the city waited, indifferent yet watchful, as Eleanor stepped into a future shaped by whisper, resolve, and the unknown judgment of the man she was soon to call her betrothed. She knew that by nightfall she would no longer belong solely to herself, but to a story already in motion, one that might shelter her or ruin her, depending upon how firmly she held her ground before society decided her fate. The announcement of the engagement traveled through London with the speed peculiar to rumor, neither swift nor slow, but persistent enough to reach every drawing-room by nightfall. Eleanor felt its weight before she heard a single word spoken aloud. Doors that had once hesitated now opened with a fraction more warmth. Invitations arrived folded with sudden courtesy, and glances lingered where they had once slipped past her. She understood the change instinctively, not as acceptance, but as appraisal, for society examined her now as property newly claimed rather than as a woman newly valued. Her first meeting with the Duke of Ravenshollow took place in his mother's townhouse, beneath ceilings darkened by age and authority. He stood when she entered, tall and composed, his expression carefully neutral. His features were not handsome in the careless sense, but precise, shaped by restraint and expectation. When he bowed, the gesture was exact, neither intimate nor cold, and when he addressed her, his voice carried the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I am told we are to be acquainted under unusual circumstances." Eleanor met his gaze with steadiness born of necessity. "Circumstances beyond either of our choosing, Your Grace," she replied. Something like approval flickered in his eyes, though it vanished as quickly as it came. They spoke then of arrangements, of public appearances and carefully timed visits, of which rooms might be entered together and which required a witness. The Duke listened more than he spoke, weighing her responses as if measuring their strength. At last he said, "Appearances are the currency of our world. We must spend them wisely, for once depleted, they are seldom replenished." From that hour, Eleanor's life assumed a new choreography. She walked beside him in Hyde Park, their measured pace inviting notice without encouraging familiarity. At Almack's assembly rooms, she stood at his arm beneath chandeliers that cast judgment as readily as light, conscious of every whisper stirred by their proximity. He offered her his arm with impeccable timing, withdrew with equal precision, and spoke to her in tones that conveyed respect without warmth. Yet in moments unobserved, she sensed his attention sharpen, as though he listened for something she had not yet said. Tokens of their supposed attachment followed, as inevitable as they were dangerous. A ring, modest yet unmistakable, was placed upon her hand in his mother's presence, its weight a constant reminder of the role she played. Notes were exchanged, brief and formal, their language correct enough to be read by others, yet edged with meanings only they would recognize. Eleanor discovered that the Duke wrote with clarity and restraint, each word chosen with care, revealing nothing carelessly, concealing nothing necessary. It was during these exchanges that the first fracture appeared. A whispered remark at a dinner, too deliberately casual to be innocent, revived the memory of her uncle's disgrace. Eleanor felt the room tighten around her, felt the past tug insistently at the present. Before she could speak, the Duke did. His voice was calm, his words unadorned, but his defense was absolute. He did not argue her innocence. He assumed it. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Later, alone in a carriage, Eleanor thanked him with quiet sincerity. He acknowledged her gratitude with a nod, then surprised her by saying, "No one should be required to answer for another's sins." The statement lingered between them, heavier than the silence that followed. She wondered then whether his concern was duty alone, or something less easily named, and whether she dared hope for the latter. The season advanced, and with it the danger. A rival, disappointed and well-connected, allowed doubt to surface at a ball, suggesting that the engagement was a convenience rather than a commitment. The rumor spread with alarming speed, sharpening into speculation. Eleanor felt the familiar chill of exposure return, sharper now for having briefly known shelter. That night, beneath the glow of countless candles, the Duke crossed the room with deliberate intent. He took her hand before all assembled, his touch firm, unmistakable, and spoke her name as though it were already his to claim. In that moment, the lie became something far more perilous, and far more difficult to abandon. Society accepted the gesture with collective assent, yet Eleanor felt the cost of it settle deep within her chest. She had not anticipated how swiftly pretense could harden into expectation, nor how easily her heart responded to protection offered without condescension. In quieter moments, she observed the Duke as one studies weather, noting changes almost imperceptible to others. His reserve softened when he listened, his formality eased when he believed himself unobserved, and once, when she laughed despite herself, surprise crossed his face as if he had forgotten laughter could belong to him as well. Still, restraint governed them both. They spoke of nothing that could not be justified, shared no confidence that might not be dismissed as necessity. Eleanor sensed his vigilance, understood that he guarded not only her reputation, but his own carefully ordered life. Yet the more he guarded, the more she perceived the cost of such discipline, and the more she felt the danger of wishing to ease it. When the evening ended and the crowd dispersed, Eleanor returned home aware that she stood at the edge of something irreversible. The city outside her window glimmered with indifferent promise, carriages rolling onward, unaware of the fragile truth they carried. She removed the ring and set it upon her dressing table, studying its quiet gleam. Tomorrow, she would wear it again. Tomorrow, she would step once more into the gaze of society. For now, she allowed herself the smallest indulgence of hope, knowing full well that hope, like scandal, once awakened, could not easily be silenced. She slept uneasily, dreaming of chandeliers dimmed to embers, of hands offered and withdrawn, and of a future balanced delicately between gratitude, fear, and unspoken desire that refused rest. The weeks that followed pressed upon Eleanor and the Duke with a gravity neither had anticipated, until pretense itself demanded truth. The rumor that had threatened them did not vanish, but it bent and thinned beneath the weight of the Duke's public claim, and in its place rose expectation, heavier and more exacting than suspicion alone. Eleanor felt the change most keenly in private, where silence invited honesty she had long denied herself. She could perform the role before witnesses, yet when she found herself alone with the Duke, the air seemed to pause, awaiting a truth neither had named. It came one evening as rain traced soft lines down the carriage windows, blurring the city into shadows and light. They had dined formally, observed until the final bow, and now sat opposite one another, close enough to feel the warmth of shared confinement. Eleanor spoke first, her voice steady with resolve sharpened by fear. She asked what would become of her when the season ended, when the lie was no longer useful. The Duke listened without interruption, his gaze fixed upon her as if memorizing the question. When he answered, it was not with assurance, but with candor. He confessed that duty had guided him until duty failed to explain her. He admitted that protection had become preference, and preference an attachment he could neither dismiss nor indulge lightly. The honesty unsettled Eleanor more than flattery ever could. She realized then that the danger lay not in exposure, but in believing she might be chosen. Days later, the Duchess summoned them both, her approval neither gentle nor withheld. She spoke plainly of consequence, of alliances weighed like coin, and of marriages that survived because affection learned discipline. Eleanor listened, understanding that consent here required courage equal to defiance. When the Duchess withdrew, leaving them alone, the Duke turned to Eleanor with a gravity unmarred by doubt. He asked her not for gratitude, nor for compliance, but for truth. Eleanor answered without evasion. She spoke of loneliness, of a life lived in careful margins, of the exhaustion of being forever acceptable, never essential. The Duke replied quietly, "I would not have you here if I did not wish you to remain." The simplicity of the declaration struck deeper than any vow she had imagined. What followed was not spectacle, but resolve. They chose honesty before witnesses, and restraint in private, allowing society to believe it had won, while they claimed something quieter and more enduring. The season ended not with scandal, but with a marriage spoken plainly, witnessed by few, and accepted by many. Eleanor stood beside the Duke, no longer borrowed, no longer provisional. As they returned once more to the tea-room where her solitude had first been judged, she took her place without hesitation. The city watched, as it always would, but this time she was not alone. She understood then that dignity was not the absence of risk, but the courage to choose one's own truth. The Duke regarded her with a quiet pride that required no audience, and Eleanor felt the last of her old fear loosen, not because the world had softened, but because she had learned how to stand within it. London remained unchanged, vigilant, and exacting, yet she moved through it with a steadiness earned rather than bestowed. In choosing truth from within a lie, she had claimed authorship of her own name, and in doing so, found a future neither whispered nor borrowed, but spoken aloud. The Duke knew this, and it was for this reason he loved her, though he would speak the word rarely, as one speaks of sacred things, with care and reverence. Their life together unfolded not as legend, but as labor, shaped by listening, tempered by choice, and sustained by mutual regard. Eleanor remembered often the day she had sat alone with her tea, and she did not regret it, for without that stillness she might never have recognized the moment when her life began to change. The past no longer pursued her through whispers, and if memory lingered, it did so without power to wound. She had not been rescued, nor elevated by chance, but met by a man willing to see her as she was, and to stand beside her once the watching ceased. In this, Eleanor found her peace, and in their shared restraint, a love both deliberate and profound. The city would remember little of them, and that was well, for they required no witness beyond each other. What endured was not spectacle, but certainty, and in that certainty, Eleanor at last belonged not to rumor or mercy, but to herself, and to the future she had chosen with open eyes and an unguarded heart. Thus ended the season that taught her the difference between being seen and being known, and in that knowledge lay the truest victory of all. The Duke's name remained powerful, yet it was Eleanor's quiet constancy that steadied their household, shaping choices with empathy rather than fear. Together they learned that affection need not announce itself loudly to endure, and that trust, once earned, asked little more than care. In time, even the Duchess regarded Eleanor with satisfaction unalloyed by calculation, for the choice had proven wise in ways no ledger could record. The lie that had begun their story faded into memory, leaving behind a truth resilient enough to weather silence, scrutiny, and time. Eleanor sometimes smiled at the thought, knowing that what society had meant to contain had instead released her. She poured tea without ceremony, welcomed guests without apprehension, and spoke when she wished, not because she must, but because her voice mattered. In this quiet mastery of her days, she recognized love not as rescue, but as companionship, freely chosen and firmly kept. The world would continue its judgments, but Eleanor and the Duke had ceased to live by them, and so their story closed not with applause, but with peace.